Hey there, it's Jody. Summer is almost here in this 500 square foot garden here in Northern California. Let's check out the changes in the latest garden tour. The garden vista now has shade cloth along the fence to increase the harvest this summer. To share the difference, I'll do a comparison from the last garden tour. While the shade cloth does provide some privacy, I am also able to unclip the bottom areas of this cloth to place it over any plants that are stressed when the weather gets over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The shade cloth also helps with water retention for the garden pots, so I shouldn't have to water nearly as frequent. I discovered this idea last year when I used a shade cloth over a coneflower that I noticed was super stressed after getting transplanted in the heat of the summer. I noticed a cucumber plant that was 2 pots over climb right underneath that shade cloth, and it started to produce blooms. Garden Alley now has some mats here to keep the mud off my shoes. I also added a border here to create a flower bed to attract more pollinators. As for the edibles, I planted squash, sweet corn, beans, and tomato plants. I also planted a Shiro dwarf plum here that's self-pollinating, which means I won't have to buy another plum tree to make it fruitful. Since this is a bare root, I should have fruit in about 2 years. One gardener rule of thumb is always to buy your bare root fruit trees right away, so that counter begins. Speaking of fruit, the tomatoes should set fruit in the coming weeks. The tomato varieties that I have planted in this area include Roma, Sun Gold, and San Marzano. I decided to focus more on tomatoes and squash this year as I missed the high volume of harvest last year when I dedicated a lot of the space to cucumbers and melons. As for the squash, I already have a bloom here, so I should have my first squash in a week. But let's talk about why this little squash plant in this area is much happier than the rest I planted in the garden. I have created the ideal setup for a new gardener here. This is a 25-gallon garden pot. 3 of these plants provide nutrients and pest control. There's a sweet corn in the back, a Ford hook in the middle, 2 nasturtiums in front, 1 pinto bean in front, and 2 marigolds. The beans provide nitrogen for the plants. The nasturtium attracts pollinators, and some pests prefer eating it instead of the squash plant, so it's kind of like a sacrificial plant in that regard. Once it warms up, the nasturtium will retire, providing nitrogen for the corn and squash. And the marigolds will repel pests and prevent any burrowing pests in the soil from taking nutrients from the plants in this pot. As for the beans, I am doing a pinto beans experiment this year to see how many pounds of pinto beans I can harvest in a year. I heard that 8 pinto bean plants can feed 1 person for a year. Since pinto beans are a bush variety, they remain fairly small, so I'm going to cram every single pinto bean that sprouts in this area of the garden. Future plans for the area: harvest the potatoes and plant okra, beans, and squash. The lantern garden has a fresh coat of paint on the lanterns to provide a pop of color to this area. I planted cherry tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, and beans. As for the flowers, I planted some beautiful peach-colored Calabrosia flowers, as they are known to spill over flowers in the pot. Future plans for this area: create 2 sturdy vertical trellises for both sides of the lantern garden and plant more pole beans. The boardwalk now has more garden space now that I removed the wild grass and the periwinkle plants in the back. Here's the difference between last month and this month. I also moved out the strawberry plants to make space for tomatoes, squash, and sweet corn. The garden pots in the back have red potatoes, ginger, and an adorable baby papaya plant I planted next to the sweet potato plant. This 15-gallon garden pot size is supposed to be fine for them, but while I wait for it to grow, this sweet potato will give it some nitrogen. If everything goes well, I should have a harvest of papaya fruit in 6 to 8 months. Future plans for the area: move out the orange snapdragons and plant peppers and squash. Gardenville is finally transformed with a new vertical space. I am in constant awe of how much more garden space I have behind the aeration pots below. If you missed the video on how this vertical space was made, check the description for the link. Since the last video, I moved out the yellow zinnias and replaced them with these pink zinnias to bring out the blue in the Lithidora plant. As for the aeration pots below, there's bee balm, catmint, lavender, nasturtium, thyme, rosemary, mint, and strawberries. When I moved the strawberries from the boardwalk area to these pots, it didn't take them long for them to thank me by growing 2 times since the move. If we walk this way, the barrel pot that I placed here has a baby papaya plant. This garden pot currently has buckwheat, sunflowers, and petunias until the papaya tree gets a bit larger. Paw Crossing has more lovely petunia blooms, and the bridge has been painted the same purple-blue color as the star-shaped flowers on the Lithidora plant. I have to say, I was going to paint the bridge a rustic teal color, but I like how it stands out among the green foliage. The wildlife area had tons of gaps near the wild grass, so I covered those areas with some of the pots from the garden path to create a new flower bed that is in remembrance of my cat and her love for sunflowers. I also planted squash in this other garden pot. Future plans for this area plant marigolds, beans, nasturtium, and corn with the squash, and plant more sunflowers in this area. The greenhouse is booming with activity before the summer hits. I'm in here at least a few times a week. I moved out tons of trays of seedlings to the garden patch as I was running out of grow light and sunlight space in the greenhouse. As for seed planting, I'll plant a small amount of melons, pumpkin, and winter squash indoors. But the focus this year is going to be about succession planting squash, beans, cucumber, and Malabar spinach every 6 weeks, up until September, to ensure I always have a plant to fill in any empty garden space, and this should hopefully increase the production of food this year. Garden path has more herbs and flowers, but I'm also using it as a place to harden off the seedling plants that are under the grow lights, as this garden space gets about 6 hours of sunlight a day. Currently, there are tons of flowers, tomatoes, peppers, okra, and squash seedlings. There's the changes in the garden in May 2022. Let me know what plant varieties you're growing this year. Until next time.